Πέρασες το βλέπω. Το δεύτερο πρόγραμμα. Ναι. Εντάξει. Υπάρχει ένα φίλο με βοήθεια.
Έχει μοιραστεί το handout.
Έχει μοιραστεί. Ωραία. Για όσους δεν έχουν το πρόγραμμα.
Στο μικρόφωνο, αν θέλετε, στο μικρόφωνο.
Σηκώστε χέρι να πάρετε ένα άκρη και να πήρε στο πρόγραμμα. Όλοι δεν καταλαβαίνουν, εντάξει. Σίγουρα του Ελλάδος μπορεί να ξέρουν μεγάλο πρόγραμμα, Αλέξανδρο του Ελλάδος. Είναι του Τέξας, στο Όστεν. Και όταν προέρχεται το πρώτο κλίμα,
Felipe. Gabriele, your mail, please. Your email. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I will write that.
Yes.
All I have to say is that it's a rare and immense pleasure to be functioning in the context of the Greek University. For 60 years, I have been doing this in different departments in faraway Texas. So, without further tapping,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome back for this late afternoon session, and thank you to everybody, to the team here for inviting me to the inauguration of this extremely important project. It's a great honour to be included in this and to be present in the company of so many great scholars and also of scholars still in training. So I'm very glad to be here, and hopefully what I'm going to tell you is going to actually connect quite well with some of the discussions we had this morning, but maybe take us a little later into Plato's career. So I'm going to be talking about Plato's use of Athenian myth in the dialogues and of Athenian cult and ritual, and how he weaves those into his writing to powerful effect. So Plato's skill as a storyteller and world builder is difficult to parallel among his peers and possibly among many writers throughout history. While other writers used and retold Athens myths as powerful rhetorical tools and to make political points, Plato's transformation of those myths simultaneously embedded them within his own thought and his own reworkings and modelling of the cosmos, and also affirmed his own and his family's ancient connection to his city. So what I hope to explore in this paper is the multiply formed, complex role of specifically Athenian myth and cult in Plato's work, and the way in which Plato draws from and interacts with a wider Athenian and Greek culture in which patriotic myths were exploited for political and social use. So we've already had alluded to funeral speech, used Athenians' myths of its work, and to Greek tragedy with Euripides on Euripides and his Trojan women, using myth for political criticism. So I want to show how Plato uses the framework of an Athenian myth and cult to transform and integrate ideas, stories and arguments. And I also want to sort of embed him, or demonstrate the way in which that thought is embedded in Athens. And as we discovered this morning, Plato couldn't have done what he did anywhere other than Athens. And his connection to his home city is such that not only papers this morning, but also Robin Waterfield's recent full-length biography was titled Plato of Athens. Athens is central to Plato. But what I want to kind of show is that when Plato uses Athenian myth, he's what in English idiom is called having his cake and eating it. He's using a resource, but he's consuming a resource, but he's also transforming and preserving it. And that shouldn't be happening at the same time, but it is. And so I'll particularly look at how he undertakes that in some of his later dialogues. And again, as we move into Plato's later career, a point in which he's well established as a teacher and a leading public intellectual in his home city, he recalibrates his approach, his relationship to the city, although that sense of mourning for Socrates isn't absent from those works, it's no longer perhaps as continually foregrounded. And I'm particularly going to look at the use of Athens in the Timaeus and the Critias. And the Timaeus was long regarded as Plato's most significant work, and of course people who work on later traditions will be aware of how central it was to the whole Platonic tradition in later antiquity. But it's also there in his modern reception. It's the book he's holding in Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican. So here we are in a School of Athens, actually in Athens, a good place to be thinking about those issues. And I'm going to be drawing on and really leaning quite heavily on important work that has been done in recent decades on the thought in the Timaeus and the Critias, notably work by Brody and Johansson, also more recent work by Andrea Nightingale and Vilias Bartninkas, very recently published by Cambridge, and various other bits of foundational work which I think the whole community of people who work on Plato knows and reveres. So, starting in the middle period of Plato's work, we can see him making significant use of Athenian myth and ritual. So looking back to the Symposium, we find him making explicit reference to the Eleusinian Mysteries, the big autumn festival in which Athenians could go to Eleusis, to the west of city, to be initiated into a cult which gave them the information they needed to access a superior kind of afterlife. It seems very clear that Plato was a member of this cult. It would have been quite unusual if he hadn't been initiated, but aspects of how he describes the afterlife, even before he starts bringing in elements from stories he finds in Italian religion, seem to suggest that he is part of this cult. And certainly Diotima, as she speaks to Socrates, this is text 1 and text 2 on the handout, connects the ascent to knowledge to that experience of being initiated in the mysteries. So that idea that philosophical knowledge and religious revelation are analogous to each other and might stand in for each other is quite central to Plato's thinking and to how he represents the process of philosophical inquiry. So that idea of the beautiful highest mystery to which you can ascend, you will see something visible which will be revealed to you, I think that's a very important image, beautiful and powerful, but also highly considered, resting firmly in the physical environment of Athens. And again, another great resource for thinking about ancient philosophy, and I'm drawing on the volume from, I can't remember, how long ago was the Ancient Academy conference that the beautiful volume was published?
2012.
2012. Well, that's an inherent, vital work for understanding the academy and how it's embedded in the physical and cultic environment of Athens and how its development interrelates with that of the city. So by linking the Eleusinian mysteries to the ascent to knowledge of the forms in the symposium, Plato is simultaneously emphasizing the importance of one Athenian context, Eleusis, but also translating it to another context, the Academy, which of course famously had a shrine to Eros at its entrance, marking it as a site of homosocial encounters and relationships between citizen men as they strove to improve themselves and each other through physical training and education. So again, we see that idea of a religious inquiry, a theoria of some sort, as an analogy to philosophical inquiry. We might see other references to Eleusis dotted through the middle period. Some people have on occasion wondered whether the Republic's cave is in some sense a kind of replica of the Hall of the Mysteries at Eleusis, somewhere where you go and knowledge is revealed to you through the display of objects and torchlight. It's a complicated scene. This is text 3 on the handout. As Malcolm Schofield has said, it's open to many interpretations simultaneously. There's clearly a lot about knowledge, a lot about democratic process, a lot about demagoguery, but I wonder if that idea that there's that in a sense that it's a way of displaying the knowledge provided in a democratic context, that failed political knowledge, which Thucydides criticises, which Plato follows him in doing so, is somehow a kind of parody, a failed version of the mysteries. It might be a bit edgy for Plato, who was at the fringes, who of the circles whose relatives were at the fringes of the circle. He was still too young then to be involved in the profanation of the mysteries, but he certainly knew people who were involved in that. So again, very complicated, but the idea that Athenian democracy does things in an incorrect manner, which leads to problematic, untrue knowledge, and teach you the wrong secrets, initiate you into the wrong things, I think might be doing something there. And the cave might be a kind of anti-telesterion. So Plato has both emphasised the importance of political knowledge and of the importance of the city in teaching you that knowledge, but also reinforced the idea that, that the democracy struggles to generate it. So, going to move on now from the middle period, progressing through time, slightly later in Plato's career. So this is a sort of developmentalist account, and of course there's a great deal of critical thought as to what constitutes the correct or proper ordering of the dialogues, but I think we can see some distinctive features in some of the later works, and part of that is the way in which they relate to Athens itself. Throughout his career, Plato used festival contexts as settings for dialogues, and we see those in the opening scenes. It's the reason everybody's got together. Part of that is a kind of dramatic convenience. How are you going to get people in the same room so they can talk to each other and you can have the holders of different ideas speaking to each other? In other cases, it's not so much a convenience. It seems to be doing something a bit more than that, emphasizing seriousness perhaps, emphasizing the importance of what's at stake in philosophical activity. So even a dialogue like the Lysis, there's a festival going on at the gym while the conversation is taking place. So a bit more than simple dramatic necessity going on. A ritual and religious context adds specific colour to the discussion, and we can see perhaps Plato using specific festivals as a marker of importance. So whereas the Republic takes place in the context of a festival of Bendis, a new goddess brought to the city by immigrant tradespeople as its setting, the Timaeus replaces that with the Panathenaea as the Parmenides, the key festival of the city's patron goddess herself, the one who's standing above us somewhere, I'm not quite sure which direction, somewhere above us outside now, in the way in which she stood over the ancient city. So, text 4 on the handout, from that opening scene of the Panathenaea, you've got the setting is in a house in the Kounikos, which is of course close to the Pompeion, where the procession up to the Acropolis for the Panathenaea took place, but also is the place at which you leave the city walls to go to the academy and presumably to go to Plato's own property along that. So the Panathenaea was a way in which the city shaped and performed itself, replicating its social structure in the ordering of the grand procession and its makeup of different sections of the city, different kinds of people, which accompanied the robe woven by citizen girls, which is going to be presented to the goddess. And it's an appropriate moment, perhaps, to set inquiries into cosmological ordering and metaphysical exploration. It's a time at which the polis takes shape and perhaps the world more broadly. So that's the setting for the Panathenaea. It's also evoked again as the setting for the Timaeus, and is the occasion on which the speakers are assembled in an unnamed house in Athens. And there are multiple paths again to follow in understanding why it's significant, beyond the marking importance and manoeuvring non-Athenians into the same room as Socrates. Plato might, on some accounts, be setting the speeches, especially that of Timaeus of Locri in southern Italy. Timaeus appears to be a fictional character, but our certainty on all these matters is slight, against the performances which were also a part of the festival. A complete performance of Homer's epics by a relay team of the best rhapsodes, trained performers who's specialising in epic recitation, was one of its major events. So perhaps, just as the participants in the Republic failed to attend the nighttime festival of Bendis at the Piraeus, Perhaps Socrates and his companions failed to attend some part of the Panathenaic festival as they listened to each other's speeches instead. Once again, Plato making philosophy replace poetry as a source of knowledge, or at the very least setting his speakers in competition with the rhapsodes and with Homer. So we might say something about the importance of festivals in bringing people into Athens, and clearly that transportation of key people into the city was an important part of the festival, but it's also an important part of what the academy does, and Plato's role as a key attraction, somebody bringing people together to work with him, must be part of the background, something that's going on here. And I also, there's a little bit of an opposition going on. Just as people came to the Panathenaic procession goes up to the Acropolis, the route to the Academy goes in the opposite direction. And writing a dialogue set in Athens with a festival setting perhaps also encourages other people, if it's been circulated across the Greek world, to think about coming to Athens and taking part of this. So maybe one piece of work that some of the dialogues are doing is a kind of write it and they will come exercise. So Timaeus has come to Athens. Critias, and not the other key participant to make a significant contribution to the speeches, is of course himself an Athenian and a relative of Plato. Some dispute as to which generation he represents. Is he the Critias of the 30, or another member of the family holding that name, or a kind of amalgam of all of them? And it doesn't really matter because we're in the non-linear imaginary time of the dialogues, so chronology of generations isn't necessarily going to work as it does in the real world. But this is part of this. His speech brings Plato's family connections into play in the dialogue. This is his mother's family, and he is in presenting this speech, bringing himself into this tradition. So just as the cave suggests that Athenians are communicating incorrect knowledge to each other, Critias offers a story which unfolds to reveal that the Athenians are ignorant of their own prehistory. So again, that idea of failed political knowledge, failed transmission of knowledge in the city. Socrates is asked to see the ideal city in motion. I think that's a really interesting, I've explored that in other talks, that what exactly that means, what a kind of radical idea of visualizing movement in a culture that doesn't have many ways of doing that. There's no time-based media in Athenian culture other than the drama on stage, where traditionally you wouldn't be representing the city in action, you'd be having a messenger telling you about it. So again, I think it's a really interesting, complicated thing going on, and Critias does slightly lay it on in introducing it in, so that's text 5 on the handout, where he gives a kind of transmission story of the origins of this story, which was originally told by Solon based on his travels to Egypt, told to his kinsman and relative Tropides, who is the ancestor of Critias and thus also the ancestor of Plato. Very important to note in text 5, there's quite a lot going on, that there are megalakai phanasta halaya erga. There's a very clear nod to Herodotus's methodological poem. So there's been a lot of very interesting scholarship on the way in which Plato transforms historiographical method in producing this discourse. Also the idea of destruction through cataclysm and time. And again, Plato is drawing on some historiographical and mythical precedents, but this is something he transforms and makes entirely his own. So what Critias' story that he will eventually go on to start telling in the Critias, and that he sort of summarises in the Timaeus, is one which rewrites the Athenian past, presenting an alternative set of great deeds, the ones which were told in the funeral speeches, the helping the Heraclides and the returning the Argive dead, and defeating the Amazons and the Othel, which I've forgotten. But there is a set group of deeds which are repeated in the funeral speeches. This story seems to be set to replace them, and the occasion on which Critias heard it was being retold at a competitive performance between the fathers, so citizens performing and to each other rather than a paid entertainer entertaining them. I think that might be important too. So I won't go into the details of the imagined early Athens and the way in which its landscape reshapes the city to demonstrate the ways in which it's more virtuous than the rocky, infertile, modern Athens of Plato's time. But I think that the temporal positioning is very important. That idea of temporal priority being first and most ancient, that idea of the first finder, is so key in myth as well as in philosophy. And the rites at Eleusis themselves marked Athens as the place to which Demeter's gifts were first received by a community, a point that Socrates, who we've already encountered today, liked to make much of. So Timaeus' speech, even itself, appears to be completely in contrast to this story by Critias, to offer something completely different, much more cosmological and philosophical. Is it that Plato completely seeks to replace the kind of storytelling that Critias has done in transforming Athenian myth with something completely different, or do they somehow interact? And again, there's been a lot, as the scholars who I mentioned earlier have all, figuring out how these two parts of the complex fit together, I think is one of the key tasks to do with later Plato. One passage that is quite key in doing that is text 7 on the handout, which is the just precedes the speech which the demiurge makes to the younger gods, and tells you a little bit about who it is that the demiurge addresses to ask them to create the world and the things in it. What Plato does, has Timaeus do, is make a quite surprising claim. We should accept on faith the assertions of those figures of the past who claim to be the offspring of the gods. That doesn't sound like rigorous philosophical inquiry in any shape or form. They must surely be well informed about their own ancestors. We cannot avoid believing them, even though their accounts lack plausible or compelling proofs. Why should we believe? Why should we be believing this? And a lot of this, I think, is Bartninkas's book is really good on this, on the extent to which Plato is simultaneously working within his civic religion while doing something quite clever to transform it. But also, Plato's own family, like many of the Athenian elite, did have a god lurking at the very far end of their genealogy, and so there's a sense in which trust the elite, we know what we're talking about, is part of the part of the message here. So I think I've got a few minutes.
Yes.
A few minutes left to talk about the Critias and what that actual Athenian says in telling that story. And again, part of that tying in very closely to that idea of the young gods building the world. Critias in text 8 talks about the gods receiving their various regions lot by lot. They're clerics. And of course, in the biographical tradition, Plato's own father was said to have been a cleric holding a lot on Aegina, and that's unknown and unknowable, but it certainly was something that Athenians were transplanted into conquered lands and give allotted territory to work on. So I think that's one way in which this ties into that reusing Athenian tradition in retelling this story, but also the role of Hephaestus and Athena, two key gods in Athens. They possessed a common nature. They're both craftspeople gods. They're both lovers of wisdom and the arts. And they become the clerics of primeval Athens and fashion people sprung from the land itself. I think that that's quite intriguing, that what Plato is doing here. The story of the birth of the first Athenian from Hephaestus's failed sexual assault on Athena seems to me like the kind of story that Republics 2 and 3 suggest we should be leaving behind. Here it's been transformed into a very wholesome account of the Athenians becoming people who exhibit those capabilities of building and creating things that were demonstrated by the younger gods in the Timaeus. So I think there's a really important interaction going on between the speeches there that connects the Athenians to those kind of divine capabilities. And the final text I put on the handout, again, draws in some of those past Athenian stories, the stories of Athens, mythical kings. We have those transmitted in fragmentary form, illustrated on vases. But I think that the interesting point too is here at that idea. I think this is something I've really not thought about enough and want to think some more about. The attributes of the goddess Athena and her statue, that Athena Promachos in her armour, ready to fight for her city. Here it's used to suggest that women in primeval Athens, like the women in Callipolis, took part in military training. And that's something that obviously wasn't happening in democratic Athens. Democratic Athens was possibly one of the worst places to be a woman in the time of classical Greece because of the way citizenship was inherited through the laws of Pericles. It meant that many women, the wives of citizen men, the women who had citizen status themselves, which they could transmit to their offspring, were guarded and secluded much more than was the case in some other cities because of their role in transmitting citizenship. So women in Athens, compared with other Greek cities, compared with Rome, had a much worse time of it. And here in the Critias we have Plato acknowledging that. So I think the jury is very much out on Plato and feminism. This seems perhaps a feminist point, the exclusion of women from reproduction, the entirely homosexual world of the transmission of knowledge in some of the other dialogues, I think is a vote against. So Plato, complex and problematic, hard to understand. So I think that hopefully in this brief presentation I've shown that Athens and its civic religion play a vital part in the highly constructed and interconnected world of Platonic dialogue, and that's a connection with the built environment, the visual environment of the city in which he lived and worked. The way Plato uses myths and cult rituals involves complex transformation and reshaping, which both use the cultural heft of Athens stories as a source of authority, while undercutting or replacing them with ones that emphasize Plato's own value system. That might extend to his rebuilding of the afterlife promised by Eleusis, with a more Italian-flavoured Pythagorean or Orphic system in some of the dialogues, but what it most certainly does is involve a criticism of the democracy as a regime in which political knowledge is devalued, transmitted incorrectly, and misunderstood. So Plato uses Athenian religion as part of his critique of democracy, and I feel that one of the ways in which he is laying hold of it demonstrates his commitment to something which is core to Athenian civic life and identity, and yet can perhaps be separated to some extent from its basis within the city. Thanks.
And now have a period of discussion, make some notes of
I'll put glasses on that I can see the audience. Angie, what do you want to
I think I'm trying to make notes of headline. So first, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much, Karen. That was really interesting. Lots to think about. I'd love to know your interpretation of what's going on in the symposium in your first two. So we've got Theotema clearly using the language of the mysteries. Just do you, we can't know the answer for sure, but do you think that this is Plato saying that philosophy now takes over from the mystery religions, that the ascent of philosophy up to the form of the beautiful, that is now the final epiphany. So philosophy in a sense is the new mystery religion. Or do you think he's saying, no, it's not a replacement, but to fully understand the mystery religions that we've already got, to fully understand what's going on, actually they are compatible with philosophy. So is it compatibilism, or is he actually saying, get rid of this old mystery religion in a way that he's sort of transforming the Olympic religion as well? Or do you go for a third way?
I think he's actually, I think he's sort of doing both. I mean, Plato often seems to run arguments at multiple levels, and you can pick up one or pick up the other, or try and puzzle out how they work together. And I don't think he's expecting, I mean, he loves mysteries. He seems to be very keen on mystery religion. I mean, he seems to have travelled to Italy precisely to experience it, to experience cults. It's almost as if being initiated at Eleusis were, it's like somebody who gets 1 to 2 and then goes on to have more and more and more, gets a buzz from it that keeps going. I think that there is some kind of so I think that he definitely doesn't want to get rid of mystery religion and initiation, but I think he also wants to run it as an analogy, both an analogy with philosophy, but also the sense that philosophical knowledge of the cosmos to some extent may replace some aspects of traditional.
Divine, that the form of beauty is divine, that the philosophical sense has a divine aspect to it. Is that?
Well, I think if you're saying it's replacing, does that leave it as divine or not? So I think you do have to kind of run both to keep the divinity in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Something in the same line, Angie. So at the end, you briefly mentioned the Orphics, the Pythagoreans. And I was wondering how in this beautiful scenery of Plato engaging with religion to think about the city, to think about politics, how this different, deviant religious movement, like the Orphics or many other probably, how would they fit in this project? Because they're not civic, you know, it's something more deviant, I would say. I love deviant.
And I think that's almost part of the reason that he's not entirely abandoning the Athenian structures. I think he's getting a lot out of those other cults and a lot of imagery, language, but I don't think he wants to get rid of the civic component, and there are points where he's really quite negative about Orphic, about travelling Orphic sorcerers. Yeah, door-to-door religious sale. He doesn't approve of that. So I think he's very strongly wedded to the view that religious activity has to be embedded to place. And there's sometimes when you read bits of his text, so like the underworld in the Phaedo, people have often said that actually has elements of a Sicilian landscape in it, and he's not been able to separate it from that vision. So I think it's quite complicated. I don't think it's at all straightforward. But I do think that connection of community and belief is important to him, even though he wants to bring in things he's learned from other people. He wants to bring in some colouring from other cults from outside Athens, just as he wants to bring in speakers from other philosophical traditions and backgrounds. So I think he wants to kind of weave them in rather than throw the Athenian stuff out. And I think that what's going on in the Timaeus Critias kind of demonstrates that it's a kind of it's a restructuring rather than an abandonment.
Yes.
Thanks so much. My question is, wonder if what role does the character of Socrates play in Plato's reappropriation, reimagining of the Athenian civic religion? Because I heard, if I understood correctly, the suggestion at the beginning that as he finished his morning of Athens and Socrates, that he was beginning then to reappropriate and play with all these elements.
Yeah.
But what about the thought about Socrates' very complicated religious leanings itself, right? His magic elements, his physic elements, or where he seems to take on and rewrite himself in the heroic myth, right? Comparing himself to Achilles in the Apology. Like if he plays a role in his reappropriation of the Athenian religion.
So Plato often presents Socrates as reenacting roles from myth. I mean, in the Euthydemus, he's Heracles. In the Republic, he's Odysseus. That's something he does a lot. I think that it's interesting to compare what Plato does with what Xenophon does, who is very clear that he is going to represent Socrates as being completely religiously conventional, or at least as not detectably unconventional in what he does. But I'm not sure that Socrates don't think that Socrates is the kind of prime vehicle for Plato's religious experimentation, and that's why I think some of the non-Socratic characters in the later dialogues are quite interesting for this, even if they're talking to Socrates or explaining. Of course, it is Socrates who's been initiated by Diotima into this alternative set of mysteries. So that certainly, it's not that Socrates is separate from that, but perhaps I think it's a marker of the distance between the need to not present Socrates as a religious innovator or as an atheist that makes it possible for Plato. And of course, if you look at the religion in the laws, we've kind of gone full circle back to a very prescriptive set of civic cults that everybody must follow, and atheism is going to get you into serious trouble. So it's so I think there's not a sort of very smooth A to B journey, but there is some linear development, and I think the kind of distancing of time of just as in courtroom rhetoric, the sort of referencing of what people did under the 30 that you're not supposed to talk about but everybody did starts to fade out as time passes. So I think it becomes less central. Defending Socrates against impiety charges becomes perhaps less central to Plato's project. But I don't think that means that it's not there, it's just not foregrounded.
Started a little late, so there's a little more time for discussion. Let me ask a question myself. There's another interesting case in philosophy where we have exploitation of imagery and the wording from Revelation, from the religious written, and that is in Parmenides'
Yes.
poem.
Of course.
If you look into that, it's in a way very
Well,
impressive.
I think that absolutely. I mean that clearly is in the background of the Parmenides itself. And when we read the dialogue, we know that the Parmenides who is speaking is the author of that poem. So we're very aware that that's a process that's going on. And clearly, I mean, there are so a very important religious story I've not touched on at all is the myth of which concludes the Republic, and that obviously I think does have a kind of stronger reference to Parmenides. But yeah, absolutely.
Are you trying to help me?
Well, only if I don't want to take anybody else's place. I was really interested. You said a couple of question answers ago that Plato really wants to tie religion to locality. But of course, if you also want to have the level, and I agree with you that the ascent to the forms is in some sense a religious experience, possibly a divine experience, maybe the forms themselves, they have divine land use, but that of course is not local.
Yeah.
I mean, that is absolutely transcendent. That is outside time and space. They are in eternity. So, is this another case of Plato having his cake and
Well,
eating
I think it might be, because I think the starting point for the role of Eros in the symposium has to be the cult in the academy. And maybe the point is that you start your journey into the mysteries when you pass and walk into the grounds of the academy. So I think it is spatialized on one level, and as you're absolutely right to say, liberates you from spatiality when you actually get there. But it has. You can't leave space from nowhere.
No, I'm entirely. This is very much fits in with my interpretation of Plato's methodology. He starts from where his audience is.
Yeah.
And then he gently, cunningly takes them
somewhere entirely different.
Without they don't even realise they crossed the boundaries.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to thank our speaker. And we go on to the second session. ancient greetings for Plato's Chimera 17a.
Thank you very much, Professor. Αγαπητέ Παναγιώτη, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, I am very honored to be involved in this program, and I would like to wish all the best for a very successful first year. My talk has a somewhat different title. It will be on Plato's Timaeus 35a instead of 17a. My soul is both in Alexandria and in Rome and everywhere. Porphyry of Tyre, Plotinus' student and editor, to whom these words belong, thinks that although our soul is in some sense omnipresent, and thus both in Alexandria and in Rome and everywhere, it is nevertheless really in no place, and thus not locally present in our body either. Rather, the soul relates to the body through its powers, which manifest in the various parts of the body. Yet, when Porphyry discusses in more detail how the material soul relates to and operates in the locally extended body, his considerations keep returning to Athens. This happens mainly in three ways, which I endeavor to outline in this talk, namely, first, by acknowledging the authority of Plato and Aristotle. Porphyry's views are situated in the wake of a long tradition of interpretation of Plato's Timaeus 35a, a passage which Plotinus describes as divinely revealing, and where the soul is said to be both indivisible and divisible. But at the same time, Porphyry follows Aristotle closely. Second, Porphyry criticized Longinus, his teacher in Athens, in light of his own Plotinian views. Indeed, Porphyry's account presupposes Plotinus' reading of Plato, especially Aeneid 4. These are T2 and T3 on the handout. You may have a look to get a glimpse of Plotinus' views, but there are, of course, many other passages. The questions raised here perhaps also echo Porphyry's and Plotinus' 3 days long debate on the soul's connection with the body mentioned in the life of Plotinus. Third, Porphyry illustrates his position with an analogy indebted to the imagery of the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most prestigious religious festival organized by the polis of Athens. The analysis that follows focuses on verbatim excerpts from Porphyry's On the Powers of the Soul, which are preserved by Stoveos and which I read in light of related passages drawn mainly from the Sententia but also from other works. Porphyry thought that the soul as such is indivisible. Yet, when connected with the body, it is indivisibly divisible. The parts of the soul are immanent incorporeal entities which subsist alongside the bodily parts and are conceived of through a process of abstraction from the body. Porphyry contends that Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and the Eleusinian Mysteries all agree on this, which, however, is in reality his own innovative view. First point, then, Plato and Aristotle. Plato's doctrine of tripartition is exposed in the Republic, but also in the Timaeus and in the Phaedros. Plato expresses doubts about his own theory by wondering whether the soul in its true nature is uniform or multiform, and whether the soul is one and all alike, or of multiform aspect like the body. Aristotle famously criticizes Plato in the Anima. However, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he concedes that the soul may be said to have 3 parts, and he attributes this teaching to extraneous discord nosis and tis exoterikis logis, while positing in Book Alpha a relationship between the classification of the virtues and the division of the soul. Unlike Plotinus, who is less critical of Plato, Porphyry follows Aristotle's criticism of tripartition by pointing out that the three parts are not enough for exhausting all that the soul is capable of. Like Aristotle, Porphyry also rejects the idea that the incorporeal soul has parts that are separable in space, topo, or in extension, megethi, while accepting, on the contrary, that the soul has many, or in fact infinite powers. Thus, taking into account the Nicomachean ethics as well, Porphyry maintains that, this is T4 on the handout, tripartition has been applied to the soul because of the constitution of the virtues. I take this to mean that for Porphyry, each of the three parts of the soul corresponds to a group of activities involved in the exercise of one of the three virtues, namely wisdom, courage, and moderation, while justice, which in the Republic is said to embrace all other three cardinal virtues, is attributed to the soul as a whole. The correspondence of the virtues to the tripartition of the soul is, of course, a Middle Platonic doctrine, to which Plotinus also adheres. Putting all this together, Porphyry argues that Platonic tripartition does not concern the true nature of the soul. Rather, it should be understood as a theory about virtue ethics. Plato does not only moderate his claim about partition, but, like Aristotle, he also speaks in terms of powers of the soul in the laws. Aristotle's criticism, on the other hand, is directed not against Plato, but rather against a widespread, albeit mistaken interpretation endorsed by the majority, whose ignorance may translate, as for instance in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, a settlement for exoteric, ethical doctrines as opposed to profound metaphysical theories kept in secret. Porphyry holds that beyond such superficial readings, Plato and Aristotle in reality agree on the indivisibility of the soul. Second point, Longinus. In T5 on the handout, Longinus thinks that the soul as such is partless, but that it becomes multipartite in the bodies. Multipartite may here be an equivalent of tripartite if Longinus follows Plato closely, and if, I suspect, T5b also refers to Longinus, so the fragment should perhaps be a little bit longer. Whereas what is in italics is, I take it, Porphyry's answer to Longinus. Moreover, Porphyry ascribes to his teacher the view that the soul has many powers. Longinus may have thought that, as in T5b on the handout, that the soul occupies various parts of the body in order to exercise its various activities. To such a claim, Porphyry answers in T6 on the handout that it is not the soul itself that occupies the parts of the body, but rather the activities of the soul, which, by being distributed to the bodily parts, ascribe division to the soul. The soul is not in body, as Porphyry underlines in the Sententiae and in Simicta Zittimata. It relates to the body through the lower soul, that is, through its secondary power, which comes close to the body and to which the powers or activities manifested in the body directly belong. For Porphyry, the soul does not become multipartite either. It is partless. Porphyry and Longinus agree on the partlessness of the soul as such, but being without parts does not necessarily mean not admitting of division, being indivisible. Indeed, whereas for Longinus the soul becomes multipartite in the body, for Porphyry the soul, to the extent that it remains rooted in intellect, never ceases to be partless, and indivisible, despite its intermediate nature, which involves divisibility as well. As explained in Sententia 37, P11 on the handout, the soul is essentially a life-giving form. What in its case is sort of division, eontomy, and may thus be thought of along such lines, is in reality otherness, with the sameness remaining as well. The hypostasis soul has specific variations, parallagás ιδρυτικάς, which designate, as Plotinus parallel shows in Ennead 6, the individual souls, and also by analogy the parts thereof. Yet, although the soul as such and as a whole is indivisible, the lower soul, because of the body, receives what its own activities impart to it in a partial way. We are still in T6. Thus, in the case of the soul's life in relationship with the body, the parts, says Porphyry, perhaps exist, μήποτε υφίσταται, since the soul as such and as a whole remains indivisible and can be thought of as indivisible, despite being divisible in the sense that because of the body, the lower soul dividedly receives what its own powers impart to it, and despite the fact that it can be thought of as divisible when it is considered from the point of view of the bodily parts alongside which the soul's parts subsist. Porphyry is here close to Plotinus. The primary divisibility of the body is the reason why the soul happens to be divided in the sphere of bodies. This is a special kind of partition in which the soul maintains its indivisibility in the sense that it is present as a whole to the whole body, being divisible to the extent that it is present in every part of the body. Furthermore, Longinus maintained that the Platonic living being, to zoon, that is, the combination of body and soul, is partless, ameres, in T5. An hypothesis, Longinus may perhaps have thought that although the body is of course divisible, the living being, to the extent that it is a first substance, such as, say, Plato or Porphyry, is, as Aristotle puts it in the categories, uncatable, atomon, and thus partless. Of course, from a logical point of view, Plato as an individual is not catable. But from a metaphysical point of view, the compound of his body and soul is divisible. For Porphyry, who follows Plotinus, the living being is the compound of the body and of the lower soul. Porphyry answers to Longinus that to the extent that the body is primarily divisible and the lower soul receives what its own activities impart to it in a divisible way because of the body, being in this sense divisible, the living being is divisible as well. It is also divisible in thought, epinia, as it is by definition conceived in connection with the body. Here, the distinction between concept, epinia, the concept of the living being, and the living being itself is of special interest. A little bit further in T6, Porphyry distinguishes between the soul and the way the soul is thought of. In Sententia 44, which is not on the handout, there is also a concept, an opinia of intellect. And if Porphyry is the author of the anonymous commentary on the Parmenides, then there is also a concept of the one. Without entering into much detail on the history of opinia, in Porphyry's logical works and in the Sententia, the term denotes a concept fabricated from an external thing as distinct from that thing's existence, essence, or true nature. From Alexander of Aphrodisias to David's commentary on Porphyry's introduction, opinia is paired with logos. So perhaps the soul's divisibility in concept in Porphyry is an interpretation of Aristotle's separability of the soul in thought, logo, and it may also echo Plotinus' claims that the soul is considered to be divisible and omissi. Merisdi is said to be divisible in another form. So different kinds of things can be thought of. Epinoite. There are concepts of things that exist independently, for example, my dog or the hypostasis intellect, and of entities that do not exist independently. In the latter case, according to the Sententie, and these are T7 and T8 on the handout, incorporeal entities, immanent incorporeal entities, such as matter, the form in matter, place, dimensional time, and others, are conceived of through a process of abstraction from bodies. Inseparable bodily entities do not exist independently from bodies, but they quasi-exist alongside bodies. They are not images or representations in our soul, resulting from some empirical observation of similarities. They are entities that exist alongside or in connection with bodies, and which through a process of abstraction are stored in the soul. In order to describe the special way in which immanent incorporeals exist, Porphyry borrows from Stoic logic and semantics the verb parifistame in T9 on the handout for the Stoic use, which may be translated as to subsist alongside or independence of something else. Porphyry also expands on the Stoic use, but I will not refer to this here because of time restrictions. So, immanent incorporeal entities, as matter, form in matter, time, space, subsist alongside bodies, parifistate. Let us now return to the parts of the soul, that is T6. Porphyry holds that the parts of the soul subsist, parifistate, in the case of the soul's relationship with the physical body, that is, in the corporeal realm. He also maintains that they are ascribed to the soul because of the distribution of the soul's powers into bodily parts, upon which the parts of the soul thus apparently somehow depend. In this light, I take Porphyry's claim to be that the parts of the soul are immanent incorporeal entities which exist alongside the living body, which depend upon the parts of the body for their subsistence, and which may be conceived of, epinoite, through an abstraction from the bodily parts when we think of the soul connected with the body from the point of view of the extended body. This also seems to be confirmed by Sententia 37, which is T11 on the handout, where a soul part is said to be thought of, epinooumenon, as existing alongside material parts. However, this should not be taken to mean that, like the soul's parts, the lower soul is an immanent incorporeal entity, namely the form of the living body, as it has been proposed. The lower soul is analogous to immanent form. It relates to the body as immanent form relates to matter. But, as Andrew Smith observes, the compound of body and soul is higher in the scale of complexity than the compound of matter and form. To the extent that it is soul, the lower soul does exist in actuality. Like immanent incorporeals, it is close to the body, but unlike immanent incorporeal entities, it does not need the body in order to exist. It does not exist alongside the body. So the lower soul is ontologically prior to its parts. We may perhaps summarize Porphyry's position as follows. I now come come to the third point, namely Platonic LFCs. In T6, Porphyry illustrates his arguments with the analogy of the grain of wheat. These are the final lines of T6 I am reading. When a grain is sown, the parts exist within the framework of the relation to generation. The reason principle of wheat is not divisible, yet it is seen in something divisible, from which it reverts back to indivisibility. Similarly, in the case of the soul, although it is indivisible, the parts subsist in the time of sowing. To my knowledge, Andrew Smith provides the only detailed discussion of this baffling, as he calls it, analogy. In fact, the main problem with his discussion is that it relies on an incorrect reading of the Greek retained by all previous editions. We should retain to logu, we are in T6, of manuscripts F and A, instead of P's to olum. This is the only way to make sense of the analogy, and this reading is philologically sounder as well, because it is attested by the oldest and more reliable manuscripts, that is, F and A. What is not divisible is not the entire ear of wheat, but the reason principle of wheat. So I understand the analogy as follows. The grain is the soul. The grain that has been sown, and subsequently the new grains as a whole, is the soul in relationship with the body. The grains in the ear are an indivisible whole, since the reason principle of the ear of wheat is not divisible, just as the soul connected with the body gives itself as a whole to the body, being in this sense indivisible. The grain is present in all the parts of the ear of wheat, just as the embodied soul is present through its powers in all the parts of the body, being in this sense divisible. The grains in the ear are an indivisible whole, but they are seen in the divisible ear, just as the soul, albeit indivisible, is conceived of as divisible when it is conceived of from the point of view of the divisible body. The parts of the soul connected with the body subsist, parifistate, alongside the bodily parts, just as the grains are attached to the ear's parts. But in the harvest, the reason principle of the ear of wheat reverts back to indivisibility, since from the ear we get again the grain, just as the soul, once separated from the body, regains its indivisibility. I'm sorry. So the image of sowing goes back to Plato's Timaeus and also evokes the Orphic belief of the body as a tomb in which the soul is buried, echoed in Plato's Kratilos. Plotinus uses the image of the seed, sperma, so the terminology is different. Sperma is different than pyros in T6 and stachys. So Plotinus uses the image of the seed in order to illustrate the interpenetration of the forms at the level of intellect, which serves as a model for the unity of the soul, as well as the distribution of the hypostasis soul in the sphere of bodies. On one occasion, in Ennead 4:9, he brings in the image of the plant seed, this is T12 on the handout, to clarify that the distribution of the powers of the individual soul into the various parts of the body is analogous to the distribution of the hypostasis soul into the various bodies. Similarly, in Porphyry Sententia 37, the soul, that is the hypostasis rather than the individual soul is compared to a seed, sperma. But the example of the ear of grain is unparalleled in Porphyry, in the surviving evidence, and in Plotinus Enneads. And I submit there may be a reason for which Porphyry introduces here the image of the ear of wheat. He might, perhaps, he may be using mystery metaphor for philosophical purposes, following the lead of Plutarch on Isis and Osiris, and of other Middle Platonic philosophers, such as Numenius, who once felt he had revealed the secret of the mysteries of Eleusis through philosophy. Plotinus too seems to have exploited this tradition of allegorical interpretation, although to a lesser extent than Porphyry. We know from Hippolytus, the Christian apologist of the 3rd century, this is P13 on the handout, that the mystery night at Eleusis culminated in the display of a harvested ear of wheat, and that this was considered as the great and admirable and most perfect epoptic mystery exhibited by the Hierophant, the Eleusinian high priest, to the initiates of the highest grade. Epoptia was the highest grade, it means the viewing, and the epoptes were the initiates of the highest grade. This is also confirmed by the Cretan poet Mesomidis. We also know of attempts at a metaphysical interpretation of the sowing of an ear of grain at Eleusis. Hippolytus, Gnostic, equates the Eleusinian ear of grain with the castrated Attis, positing that the harvest marks the interruption of the process of generation and the return to higher principles. As Walter Burkert observes, the Gnostic reading has Platonic overtones. Sorry. So I would like to propose that the analogy of the ear of grain may be Porphyry's attempt to offer his own metaphysical interpretation of the highlight of the Eleusinian initiation. Porphyry may have used mystery metaphor not only in order to illustrate his argument or in order to add rhetorical emphasis, but also for paying tribute to the mysteries to which he could have participated during his time with Longinus, and thus to Athens. The Platonic interest in the mysteries of Eleusis originates with Plato himself. Here our talks meet in a way, whose Phaedros is filled with the imagery and the terminology of the mysteries, and continues until the twilight of Athenian Neoplatonism. As Jan Bremer notes, the philosopher's interest in the ritual of Eleusis kept the mysteries up to date with contemporary intellectual tendencies. By investing his position with the authority of the most revered mystery cult of antiquity, Porphyry may have intended to endow his theory of soul with a religious dimension, which would provide further confirmation to his tenets, while also pointing to philosophy as a demanding spiritual exercise similar to the extraordinary experience of initiation. Indeed, it is possible that the Middle Platonic conception of philosophy as initiation, and more especially of metaphysics or theology as the highest grade of initiation, epoptia, as mentioned before, going back to the Otimas speech in Plato's Symposium, would stand at the background, enabling Porphyry to present, as in T15, for example, Middle Platonic source, to present his argument as a profound metaphysical creed reserved to the deepest initiates of philosophy and comparable to the epoptia of the mysteries of Eleusis. By way of conclusion, conclusion, I would like to evoke a famous anecdote recounted by Porphyry in the life of Plotinus. This is T14 on the handout. At Plato's feast, I, Porphyry, read a poem, The Sacred Marriage, and because much in it was expressed in the mysterious and veiled language of inspiration, someone said, Porphyry has gone mad. But Plotinus said, so as to be heard by all, you have shown yourself at once poet, philosopher, and hierophant. Here too, Porphyry resembles the Eleusinian high priest, and philosophy is connected with the mysteries of Eleusis. The Eleusinian mysteries seem to have involved an hierogamic celebration, which was, according to the sources, closely connected with the harvest of the year of wheat. In light of Sententia 37, that is T11 on the handout, where the divine marriage between Poros or Koros and Penia, poverty, drawn from Plato's Symposium, points to the intermediate nature of the soul, Porphyry's poem might have arguably contained a metaphysical interpretation of the Eleusinian hierogamy in terms of his theory of soul. And in view of Middle Platonic considerations, similar to those found, for instance, in Theo of Smyrna's on mathematics useful for understanding Plato, which Porphyry could hardly ignore, Porphyry's successful engagement with such metaphysical questions would confer on him the status of a philosophical initiate of the highest grade, epoptis. This is T15 on the handout. As for Plotinus' reply, you have shown yourself at once poet, philosopher, and hierophant, it could be read as a poetic or symbolic passing of the master's torch on to Porphyry, expressed in veiled language through an appeal to the paramount authority of Eleusis and of Athens. Thank you very much.
We will cut a few minutes from the coffee break, so we can have 10-15 minutes of discussion.
Thank you, Irini. If I understand well, the verb parithistasai is quite important, so I would like some clarifications because, I mean, it's in text T78, the T9 is from section T7, T8. Yeah, the T9 is Sextus Empiricus.
Yes.
But it was not very clear to me. So the parts of the soul, and that's where the verb is used. You use the translation alongside. Wieland uses very different translations in T7 and T8, which show as if there is a dependence of the one on the other.
Yes.
So I'm not quite sure how you understand this alongside. I mean, it's very vague. I mean, maybe you try to translate the para, but
It is very interesting question. Thank you for asking it. So there is a whole discussion on how to translate para. Andrew Smith, for example, he says that alongside or independence of can both be used.
But they're very different. Alongside,
They are very different. Para is parallel, so
Exactly.
alongside.
Dependence in another.
If we say dependence, this involves that somehow what exists in dependence is somehow lower to the entity in comparison to the entity upon which it depends.
There is priority.
But this is not the case. This is not the case. So I think that we can translate independence of, but as long as we make clear that this dependence should not be taken to mean as ontological dependence of something only way in which there could be dependence is what Porphyry says in T7, where he explains that immanent incorporeals alone iston inner deode. They need of something else in order to exist. But this does not mean that we should posit any hierarchy in which immanent incorporeals are necessarily lower than bodies. The forming matter, for example, is not lower than the body. It is between. It is between the body and the soul. So I think that the best translation is alongside. If we say independence, we have to be very careful and explain that this is not ontological inferiority. And my problem is that I am not a native speaker of English. So if anyone has a better idea of how we could translate paripostasis, I would be very grateful. I cannot say more because it will take all the time of the discussion. But yes.
But perhaps subsistence along with something would be more or less.
Alongside, or
along with.
Along with.
So, for example, time subsists or is there when you have a soul. So, whenever you have a soul, there is time along with it. I don't think we need to introduce it in more heavy metaphysical.
Along with.
Yeah.
In the case of time, it's a little bit different because Porphyry says that in the case of intellect and soul, what exists along with something else is united with that thing along which it exists. So time is united with soul, so we cannot say that it is a paripostasis in the same sense. It is united with apostasis. So this is why I said that Porphyry expands on the use of parifistame in a sense that the Stoic could never imagine of. And in fact, he criticizes them in the final lines of T8, where he says that they haven't imagined that there is also another kind of incorporeal entities, for which he also uses.
But it seems that you cannot have the one without the other.
Yes.
Huh? I think this is the important one.
And you can't.
Thank you. Thanks so much. As you know, I share your enjoyment of the Neoplatonists without anything like your expertise. So thank you for illuminating Porphyry. Do you think that Porphyry illuminates the Timaeus? Or do you think the interest lies in the creation of his own philosophy, which of course has Platonic roots, but and it doesn't, I'm not bothered if it doesn't illuminate the Timaeus. I find it interesting anyway. But do you think it does illuminate the Timaeus?
Well, I think that the Timaeus is one of the most difficult philosophical passages that I have ever read. Porphyry's commentary on the Timaeus is fragmentary, which is a problem. So we have 5 verbatim quotations, and the rest is paraphrased, mainly by Proclus. But to me, what we have makes sense. So it gives me a path of understanding what is going on in the Timaeus, which I admit could not have found myself. So in a way, yes, Porphyry opens a way of understanding the Timaeus, but I could never say that it illuminates the Timaeus in the way that Plato, that he really can tell us what Plato means. But it is a way of understanding.
Okay, thank you so much.
Professor Tuna.
Thank you very much, Amy. I have a question that probably derives from my relative ignorance of this material, so please help me with this. I think when you had the slide, just to help you aware in your talk, it was the slide on Posidonius, from Posidonius to Porphyry. And you said, I believe, that we have an epinoia which can be fabricated, that was the word you used, from an external without presupposing anything about the existence or nature of that thing?
No, that would be silly opinion. So opinion, as David explains in his commentary on the introduction, is a concept, a kind of concept that is fabricated from a thing that does exist. So I have a concept of a dog that is something that we can see around us. But if the thing did not exist, if it were a unicorn, for example, and we have the concept of a unicorn, which is something that does not exist, that would be silly opinion. So I didn't say
What do we have regarding the parts of the soul?
oh, I think that I should have made clear when I tried to answer the first question. My intention was not to oppose opinion to existence, but to distinguish. So one thing is the dog, another thing is the concept of the dog, but they are not opposed.
No, I didn't
Okay.
think they were opposed.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get a grip
So
on this difference with regard to the parts of the soul when the soul is embodied, right? So what am I having in terms of a concept? How do I get to that concept?
the soul is one thing, the way we can think of the soul, so opinion of the soul is another thing. So we have on the one hand the parts of the soul which are immanent incorporeal entities which subsist along with the body, and when we think of them, we have an opinion of them. This is something different from the way they exist. So Porphyry keeps distinguishing between the thing and the concept of the thing. He says intellect or a concept, our way of thinking of intellect. So here in T6, he distinguishes between the soul and the way the soul is thought of, epinoumeni. In the same sense, in the same way, we speak in terms of the parts of the soul which have their own mode of existence, palphistate, and the way we think of them, opinion. That's what I was trying to say. Professor Opsom, sorry, but I'm eager to.
No, again, sorry, again on the paraphystatai. So, not as a translation, but as an interpretation of Timaeus 35a, the expression usually shortened as the visible being is actually hepi tasomarka riste ginomene usia. So and which is understood in the tradition prior to Porphyry, Plutarch, Alcinous, and so on, as that which becomes visible alongside body. So when it is in the presence of body. And I think that is the kind of meaning that is conveyed. I don't know how to translate it then, but another interesting author or text to look at that has influenced Plotinus, I think, is Alexander of Aphrodisias, who discusses this word in the context of accidental causation. So where he says it's actually as if there is no cause because something else is being caused, let's say intended by the cause, but as a side effect something else is produced as well. And there you have the alongside idea.
But he picks it up from the stories. I mean,
He picks it up from the stories, but the analysis is new there, I think. And then on the dependence, I think you can perfectly reconcile two ideas. I mean, the part that becomes divisible is of course dependent upon the soul. So there is dependence on the soul.
What is dependent on the
The lower parts, let's say the
They are
parts that become
dependent on the
divisible.
body.
No. Well, dependent on the body, that's what you not want to say.
This is what I want to say.
Well, not ontologically dependent.
Oh,
So if the
yes,
soul
not
that-
ontologically
If you look at Plotinus 4.1 and 4.2, the idea is very clear that the soul generates those
Yes.
faculties, energy, whatever, and it does so when it comes in contact with the bodies. So and that it's more
Yes.
complex than and maybe you by saying no, I don't want dependence, it is this complex story that you want to convey, I think, no?
I do not want dependence because I think that immanent incorporeals are higher, ontologically higher than bodies.
Yeah.
So, if we say that the parts of the soul depend upon bodies, we have to specify that they do not depend in the sense of being ontologically posterior. This is why I would be reluctant to use dependence.
Agreed.
I think that the lower soul is soul. It is not an immanent form. So it is lower, it is higher than, ontologically higher than the parts. And what you said about the first passage on the handout was my impression too. So when I was working on T1, I underlined these words and then I forgot to undo the bold. So I think that what is peritasomata meriston is corresponds to immanent incorporeals, and then perhaps I suspect that the second division is about the soul. So Plotinus may, and Porphyry following him, may be taking what the first expression, peritasomata meristi, to refer to the intermediate place of the immanent incorporeals, and then when he talks about that which is katatasomata meriston, that is the soul. But yes, I'm not sure about that, but I also had the idea that this peritasomata could somehow be closely connected with pariphystates. Is that what you were saying?
I think it's somewhat more complex, but you're right. So it says the soul is in the middle between the pure amenistos ousia, which is intellect or whatever, and this peritasomata ousia,
Yes.
which are immanent forms and whatever.
Yes.
But because it is in the middle between them, it has aspects of both,
Mm-hmm.
and having the peritas or its form or its mirror image of the peritasomata ousia, it also produces the lower soul part.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's what I was thinking.
that's what I think.
Thank you very much.
Well, I know there are at least two people who want to ask questions. I'm sorry, I think our time is up now. It's time to have a break. So, bravo.
Perhaps over coffee.
Gracias.